Hi everyone. This is my first attempt at one of the video segments that I'll put up on our course this semester. Our course is English 5317 at the University of Houston downtown. That is studies in the theory of rhetoric. And I'm Adam L. Wenger, Associate Professor of English at University of Houston downtown. So our course this semester is really divided into three chunks. One is sort of foundational texts and readings in rhetorical history, theoretical texts from throughout the history of rhetoric. Our second part of the course is specifically focused on the concept of ethos and identity. So there we'll be reading texts that relate to the theory of ethos and the theory of identity. And then a third segment of our course will be looking at texts that are more personal descriptions of personal identity and trying to apply some of the rhetorical theory related to ethos to those texts and understand how identity takes shape through discourse. So first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of ethos. As you know, Aristotle says that there's three modes of persuasion: logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos is a type of appeal that operates on the basis of logic or reason. And so when we try to persuade an audience by appealing to their logical or rational sensibilities, we're making use of logos. Pathos, in turn, is a type of appeal to emotion, where we try to persuade people by making them feel certain emotions or by making them observe certain emotions in us. This takes many shapes. You can see this when people try to persuade people through fear. Even a mugging is a kind of use of pathos. You need to seem scary to make the target of the mugging feel fear in order to persuade them to give you what you want. So logos and pathos, those are two of the main types of appeals. The third is ethos, though. And ethos has been a focus of my work in the past year or so. I'm in the process of completing my book called The Rhetoric of Personal Transformation, Metanoia, Ethos, and the Reinvention of the Self. And in working on that book, I really had to do a lot of thinking about ethos, and I want to do some more thinking with you all this semester. So let's start by talking in the most basic way about what ethos is. And so ethos is a appeal where we try to persuade the audience by the use of character or identity. So you want to, traditionally in rhetorical history, Cicero, Quintilian, people like this talk about how the orator has to be a good man who speaks well. And this question of virtue was really the main part of ethos in the ancient world. The idea that one needed to be virtuous to be persuasive. We see these concerns in Aristotle too. And that's important, but I think that as we progress through rhetorical history, we realize that for certain rhetorical tasks, being a good articulate person might not be the most effective way to persuade an audience. And I would return to the example of the mugging that I gave. In a case like a mugging, the ethos that you want to show, in other words, the identity you want the audience to see in you, is not a good articulate person. In part because if you were a good articulate person and approached the target of a mugging in that identity and that ethos, people might not even understand that it's a mugging. They might think that you are asking them for some money or something like that. Excuse me, sir, please give me all your money. Right? That's not nearly as effective as, give me your money! And even though there's some emotion wrapped up in the delivery of those two statements also reflect a very particular type of character. And so when it comes to muggings, perhaps the most effective ethos is the dangerous, unprincipled man, the unpredictable man or woman. And so there's a lot wrapped up in ethos. And when it comes to rhetoric, just the question of persuasion, certain ethos, certain identities are going to be more and less useful depending on the situation. Another example of ethos, I don't have any tattoos anywhere else either. One of the reasons that I don't have tattoos is I recognize that certain people, my grandparents, my mom, rightly or wrongly, believe that it's a certain type of person who gets a tattoo. And so it's not that I believe that, and it's not even that I'm against tattooing. Rather, it's that I don't want those audiences to be able to peg me as a certain type of person. I want, Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, said in one of his books, you can look up the exact quote online, but he says that he wants to be a blank screen so that people of vastly different backgrounds can project whatever they want to on him. This is a very wise conception of ethos, in the sense that he recognizes that he's going to need to be different people, or he's going to need to be a different person for different audiences. And that's very wise, right? And so I want to be the blank slate too. I don't want tattoos that might allow people to peg me. That said, Barack Obama kind of learned the hard way that there's a cost to being the blank slate. Because if you don't articulate to audiences who you are, they will make up an ethos for you. And in Obama's case, with his opponents, rightly or wrongly, truthfully or untruthfully, many people sort of pegged him as a crypto-Marxist, a secret Muslim, someone who's trying to undermine the foundational tenets of American democracy. And so if you want to be a blank slate, that's okay. But people may attribute a certain ethos to you in the absence of one that you project yourself. So, ethos is a negotiation between an audience and a rhetor, or a speaker, or a writer. We can observe ethos taking shape through text too, as we'll talk about a little later this semester. To develop that idea about the ethos as located in the speaker and the ethos as understood by the audience, I want to talk a little bit about the Aristotelian notion of ethos versus what we might call a more contemporary or postmodern view of ethos. So when Aristotle talks about ethos, and I happen to have a copy of the Rhetoric right here, I'll see if I could find quickly the passage where he talks about it. Let's see. Gotcha. He says, of the pistis provided through the speech, there are three species, for some are in the character of the speaker. That's the first place he mentions ethos. In other words, the ways that you can accomplish belief in the audience is through one's own character. And he continues, this is in section 4 of the second chapter. He says, there's persuasion through character, that is ethos, whenever the speech is spoken in such a way to make the speaker worthy of belief. For we believe fair-minded people to a greater extent and more quickly than we do others, on all subjects in general, and completely so in cases where there is not exact knowledge but room for doubt. And of course, for Aristotle, these contexts where we can't get exact knowledge are precisely the contexts when rhetoric is most useful. And he continues, and this is key. He says, and this should result from the speech, not from a previous opinion that the speaker is a certain type of person. In other words, who we believe a speaker to be shouldn't be based on who we know that person to be before they talk. This is a very strange idea to us in the 21st century. For example, if I said to you, look, when President Trump gives his State of the Union in a few weeks, don't think about what you know about or what you think you know about President Trump when you listen to the speech. Listen to the speech and let the speech tell you who President Trump is. Today we're much more different. We say, well, I already know who he is, and in turn, that your belief that you are aware of his ethos conditions the way that you receive the speech. Aristotle seems to think that the ethos is really a product in the moment, an imminent product of what we say. And so he asks for us to defer judgment. But for rhetorical purposes, ethos is something that's located in the audience for Aristotle. In other words, it relates to the audience's perception of the speaker, not the speaker's perception of himself. This is dramatically different than the way that we understand ethos in 21st century America. We recognize that there must be a negotiation between me and an audience and whether or not I get to inhabit the identity that I think I should inhabit. But today, when an audience rejects my claim of identity, we have a belief that I have a right to reassert it. And the classical example from our era might be someone like Caitlyn Jenner. Right? Bruce Jenner comes out and says, I'm a woman now. I'm Caitlyn. The cover of Vanity Fair issues a demand. Call me Caitlyn. Right? And that doesn't suggest that there's a choice, right? It suggests that the speaker or the rhetor or the individual, the subject, has a right to determine how you ascribe identity and what identity you ascribe to the speaker, right? Now, you could say, I'm not calling you Caitlyn, I'm going to call you Bruce, right? But that's going to come with very particular consequences. Platforms like Twitter, for example, had an active bot when Caitlyn was first unveiled that would censure people who referred to Caitlyn by the name Bruce or with masculine pronouns. And so, in other words, these are all reflections that today the subject or the individual is king, right? That it is me who determines my ethos, and I articulate that ethos. You take on an ethical obligation to recognize the identity that I make claim to. And so those two different conceptions of ethos will be something that we reckon with this semester. The classical notion of ethos as an extension of audience perception, the contemporary vision of ethos or identity as an extension of my self-perception. And what we'll talk about is the ways that both of those visions of ethos position the obligations of audience and speaker in terms of recognition, identification, and other concepts like respect. We did a little introduction to the basic idea of ethos here. We talked a little bit about the roles of the speaker and the audience, and we talked about a classical Aristotelian conception of ethos as based in audience perception, and a contemporary conception of ethos as based in self-perception. And so we'll pick that up at a later date. Thanks.